Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our third Zebinar. Very excited to have you as always. And if this is your first Zebinar, just want to give you a quick primer. What I've designed these to be, sorry if you hear my dog in the background, but what I've designed these to be is an opportunity for civil discourse, an opportunity for voter education, so that we can come together, me as a candidate, you as a voter, possible supporter of this campaign, to really talk the issues out, to engage with the issues, and not just give you boilerplate talking points. I really want to have actual conversations. And this is my commitment to the cause because in producing all of these webinars, I'm showing you my breadth. The fact that I've taken the time to research these issues, to learn about them, to actually develop an informed opinion on them, the same thing that I want each of you to do. And at the moment, I'm just recording these, pre-recording them because I'm building a portfolio. So when I start to go out and campaign and show people, it's already there. But after the filing deadline, early April, I'll start to do these live. And what it'll be is this little segment that I'm doing right now, the issue of the week. Then I'll open it up for a panel discussion. And then we'll have an open forum at the end where voters and supporters of the campaign can ask questions and engage. But to go ahead and jump in, the issue this week is the student loan crisis. This is very near and dear to my heart because I owe upwards of $250,000 in student loan debt. So I understand very intimately how big of an issue this is. Per usual, the Zebinar is going to be divided into three parts: a flashback, current conditions, and a future worth fighting for, where I give you a rundown of my policy preferences and my opinions on how we can address this crisis. So to begin with a flashback. Now, if you have not watched last week's Zebinar, it is pretty long, but there's a lot of information in there. Highly recommend it as a precursor to this, because when we talk about public education, that comes before higher education, before colleges and universities. So to have a good understanding of the student loan crisis, we do need to look at and understand the origin and purpose of public education first. So I would recommend, if you have not, to go check that out. But to begin, in the United States, higher education really started with the Ivy Leagues. Back in Europe, there are plenty of historic institutions that were founded in like the 1600s, probably some even before that still exist today. But the Ivy Leagues were founded as some of the first universities in the United States. Just like public education that was championed by religious organizations, if you know anything about the history of Ivy Leagues, you'll know that it was religious organizations that created them as well. All of the Ivy League schools owe their origin to religious organizations. So during this period, just like in public education, you were either well-connected and wealthy or had some semblance of power in order to gain an education at a college or university, like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown. Those are pretty much the only ones that really existed in the early 1700s. So that continued across the 1800s through the Civil War and whatnot, because most children weren't having an education past their teenage years. Once you hit 13, 14, you were expected to start working. Child labor was a huge problem throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. So along with public education, higher education also changed with World War II. Because after World War II, once Nazi Germany was defeated, it was the United States in the West versus the Soviet Union. They were fighting each other, an ideological battle. There were some hot wars like the Korean War, Vietnam, all of those wars throughout the Cold War era. But this was mainly a fight to see if democratic capitalism would win out over Soviet communism. And what leaders in the United States understood is that if we educated the public, if we gave people higher education, then they would be able to innovate, invent, create technological advances to put the United States and the West at the forefront over the Soviet Union. And we saw that. History shows that that worked. So before we get to student loans, a lot of education was publicly funded because, again, when we're fighting this Cold War, we understand that higher education is a public good. So with the Higher Education Act of 1965 and the FFEL program, the Federal Family Education Loan Program, what government did, the United States government did, was federally back private student loans. So they would say to banks, hey, if you give these people money to go to college, we'll back it. So if they can't pay, you'll get your money. Makes it a whole lot easier to know because that's the collateral, the promise of the United States government, the debt of the United States government. That continued with federally backed loans. You had some Pell Grants. All of these institutions began to develop to help finance higher education. But once we get to 1993 with the Student Loan Reform Act, what we see is the United States government transitioning from federally backing loans to actually issuing loans themselves. Sorry about that. Let me put my computer do not disturb. So in 1993, with the Student Loan Reform Act, they began to actually issue loans themselves, like the Stafford loan. That continued with private loans, Stafford loans, until 2010, when Obama federalized the entire student loan process for the most part. So private loans still exist, but we'll get into it later. They make up a very small majority of loans, or a very small number of loans now than they did back in the mid-1900s. But a big issue behind the student loan crisis is defunding, a systematic defunding of higher education at both the federal and the state level. And we can see that in this graph here. So you see, then this only goes back to 2000, right? But you see there that federal funding was a whole lot lower than state funding. But together, you see it's about $13,000. I think that's like I'm not even gonna lie and say what that is. But you can just see that once we hit the Great Recession, both federal funding and state funding kind of dropped down, especially state funding. And we see here that it's reflected in this graph. So this graph starts in 71, 72, goes to 21, 2022. So 1971 to 2021. These blue bars here represent the actual price of private higher education. The gray box is the actual price of public education, public higher education. You see there that it is a dramatic increase from the 70s to the 2020s. And I just want to take a moment to say that everyone who went to college during the 70s and the 80s that say that student loans just need to be paid, you don't have the same battle as us. So sit back and don't talk about it, because quite frankly, y'all were the ones that created this problem in the first place. So don't tell us that we just need to suck it up and pay back our loans, because we should have never had to borrow this much money in order to finance our education. Because to the right of that blue and gray box, you see what the price of education would be if it kept pace with inflation. And this is the total cost. This is tuition, fees, room and board, and books. The only thing this doesn't include is food. And I can attest to the reality of this because as an out-of-state student, I didn't even go to school in state, but I went to school at LSU, $45,000 a year in order to go to school. And you see here at a public institution, $10,000 is how much it should cost today if it was the same amount as paid in the 70s. So there's a huge issue here in regard to where colleges are getting their funding from. And this graph only goes back to 2000. So we can even see here when that funding drops off after the Great Recession. Just a moment. I'm going to take a quick pause. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. I give my dog a treat after every meal. She finished a meal. She wanted a treat. But looking at this graph and then comparing it to this, you can see the dramatic increase from 2000 to 2020. So now, this is just this small portion in time, and you can look directly in the middle of the graph and see how large that increase is from 2001 to 2021, as compared from 71 to 2001. And this corresponds with a skyrocketing of student loan debt. Because when you look down in there in 1993, each graduating class is graduating with 10 grand in student loan debt. That's literally nothing compared to today. Now they're graduating with 3 times that amount of debt for the same education. So this is a problem with how we're looking at what higher education is. When we were fighting the Cold War up until literally 1993, oh, we funded higher education because we wanted people to be innovative, to go in and to work. Now that the Cold War is over, higher education no longer gets that stature. We're no longer putting in the resources behind it, and student loans reflect that. Because it's not the public good, it's not the taxpayer, it's not our communities as a whole that are funding higher education, it's each individual student. So education has gone from a public good to a sheer commodity, and that's reflected by the amount of debt each student is taking on. So where are we at right now? Okay, and I use these pictures. We're gonna get into it, but it's the issue behind the student loan crisis is just, it's not funny, but it is comical. So let's look at by the numbers. At the moment, there are about 44 million student loan borrowers in this country. On average, each borrower owes $30,000. Excuse me, and each household owes $60,000. This comes in at a total of that's incorrect, $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. This is second only to mortgages, and I'm going to get into that more later. But that's how much debt is owed just to get an education. The yearly debt is increasing on average by $100 billion a year. And when we talk about funding split between the states, that's about each state just not paying their decent share. And 95% of these loans are federally backed. So again, this is a government-created problem because the government is the one that issued these loans. Again, looking back at the Student Loan Reform Act of 1993 and the federalization of student loans under President Obama. This is a problem created by government. Now, the untold truths of what it's like to go to a college or university today is that they're not putting their effort into academics. They are putting their effort into making their schools luxury amenities. Fancy gyms, fancy pools, and now fancy dorms. I know LSU, they just finished creating an apartment complex and there were granite countertops in the dorm apartments. And it's like, cool, I know everybody loves a nice granite countertop, but in college, seriously? Quartz at least, like granite, that is expensive. And that's where this money is going to. It's also going to administrative bloat. When you're in college these days, the number of people that you talk to, yet nobody knows what they're doing, is absolutely ridiculous. Sit down and talk to anyone about how easy it was to get counseling about their academics, what classes to schedule, and they will all tell you it was a hellhole. It was a shit show. No one knew what they were doing. No one had the time. No one had the resources, yet you're shelling out thousands of dollars a year for a half-ass response, for a half-ass experience. And it's not okay. Then to talk about the meal plans, the fact that you were paying so much money to get bad food. And I mean, it's bad food. It's not good. It's, again, in line with public education and the food they're serving in public schools. Again, it's college, so it's better, but it's not that decent. So what colleges and universities have become are businesses. They run on a business model. They're using these amenities to entice students to come there, to bring their student loans there, because they know they can't depend on state funding anymore. They can't depend on federal funding anymore. They gotta get bodies in the building with their student loans in order to keep the university going. We are paying for an experience, not an education. And that is a fundamental issue behind the student loan crisis that we need to address. And the consequences of this with student loans being only second to mortgages in the amount of debt owed, is that we will go into economic stagnation. I know so many people that have student loans, and it's like, well, I can't buy a house, can't really get a nice car, I can't go on trips, I can't contribute to the economy because I am paying the government back money that it should have been paying for my education in the first place, had it kept up with its policies from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this will lead to a collapse of higher education because people aren't going to keep going. It's not worth it. And I'm a person who I love to learn. I love knowledge. But I would not recommend to anybody to go shell out $45,000 for that shit. I'm sorry. I'm trying not to cuss, but it is like I have almost $250,000 in student loan debt. And I went to LSU as an out of state student, but I had a scholarship. And the scholarship covered my out of state fees. So it was like me being a Louisiana resident who didn't have a scholarship trying to go get an education, run of the mill student. If this is the life that this is, it's not sustainable at all to any degree. So, and I'm sorry, I forgot to put a picture in here. What policy initiatives are they currently doing to combat the issue, to combat the fact that there is $1.7 trillion in unpaid loans? Payment suspension. That's great. Biden almost didn't even do it. He extended it once Omicron came back around. So now they're deferred for everyone until May. And also, Biden has gone through and canceled predatory loans, which is great for like the 5% of people that have them. What about everybody else? It is because of Biden's generation. It's because of the greatest generation, baby boomers, Gen X. It's because of the policies that they created that now millennials and Gen Z have to deal with a student loan crisis. Remember, let's just go back for a second. Remember how much they had to pay for college in the 70s. Look at that. So if you're graduating from college, or let's not even say graduating, if you're entering college in 71, let's do some quick math, you would have been born in about 52. Okay? 1952, you're born. You go to college for $2,000 a year. You graduate from college, you get a good job. Say you graduate around 22, 23. You're going to retire in about 40 years. When is that? That's 2010. So all of the retirees sitting about now collecting Social Security on Medicare, saying that the student loan crisis is not something we need to pay for, look at the difference. We are paying nearly 10 times as much for college than you were, and not even getting as decent of an education. And this, it's you can tell I have personal stakes in this because this is absolutely ridiculous. It is ridiculous. So what should we do about it? What is a future worth fighting for in terms of the student loan crisis? First, we need to check rogue colleges because what is the role of higher education? Look, I'm not trying to shell out $45,000 a year to go to a nice gym. If I want a nice gym, I'll get a gym membership. If I want to go to a nice pool, I'll join a country club. I'm here to get an education. And there needs to be a separate mechanism where you can still go to college without having to pay for all of these things. There should be laws, there should be rules, there should be regulations for this. Why is it that if I want to go get an education at a college, I have to pay to fund a gym renovation? I don't go to the gym. At least I don't go to that gym. So why should I have to pay for it? Why should that be tied to my education? Because that's where the money is going. Because what changed from the 70s to 2020? We know all of the additions to colleges that have nothing to do with education at all. All of these amenities trying to attract student loans. The government has created a self-fulfilling problem that's feeding on itself, making it worse. And no one's checking it. Everyone's looking around saying, well, we can't cancel the loans. Well, you bailed out Wall Street, bail out us. Because if we're pulling out student loans, guess what? There is a large chunk of the population that is too rich to get Pell Grants, but we're too poor to pay for college out of pocket. So what do? What do you do when your parents make $120,000 a year and you have a family of 7? which $120,000 a year to support a family of 7 is not that much money, but you want to go to college. You can't get Pell Grants because your parents make too much. You get work study, but they're paying you minimum wage. Where is the out? You have to take on these insurmountable levels of debt in order for a chance to succeed. That's it, just a chance, because getting an education doesn't guarantee that you're going to go off and get a major job. It does not. It's simply an education. So we must return to public funding of our institutions, both state and federal. Increase your funding per student. Because if you don't, we will enter a period of economic stagnation, where countries around the world who are financing higher education as a public good are still churning people through college, are still creating innovators, are still being exceptional in the world. And that's not to say that everyone has to go to college. I'll get into that later. But we cannot deny the reality of what happened following the Cold War with the brain drain. We can't deny it. Because I can guarantee you that if we continue to go down this track, people are going to start going to school outside of the country. It'll be a whole lot cheaper if you just got to buy a $3,000 plane ticket every year to fly to Germany to go get an education. Then what? Then you're happy you're in Germany because you're inside the EU and the Schengen zone, can travel to Paris on the weekend, and you become an expat. These are the things that we have to think about when you're sitting back looking at the student loan crisis as purely a bills issue. It's not. It's not just about paying your bills. It's so much bigger than that. And we need loan restructuring, and we need it now. Why am I paying interest on student loans? Like I bought a house. I get it. If you buy a house, you're living in a house. You're living in it. You buy a car, you're driving your car every day. You pay interest on that because you haven't paid it in full, but you're still getting something out of it. Why am I paying interest on an education? What sense does that make? Education is not a commodity. It is not 1640 anymore. This is not something that is reserved for the wealthiest, richest, and the royalist among us. It is something for everyday people. And we also need to look at the fact that we need to increase the repayment period. If we have to be saddled with these insurmountable debts, at least let us pay it out for longer than 15 years. Stretch it out. Make it 30, make it 40. Make it so that it has to be paid off by the time you collect Social Security. But having payments where you're paying $8, $9, $1,500 a month for an education, for the loan, and you spend 10 years paying just the interest before you can even get to the principal, that is like economic terrorism. You're literally telling people without other options, you either take on this debt or you gamble in a world without a higher education. And we've been fed so long that we must go to college that many people are attempting it. And then they're graduating, they have debt, but no degree. What about them? So many people that are getting lost, falling through the cracks, and no one is there to help them. And we are sitting on an economic tinderbox because this is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. And we need to do something about it. And a part of this reexamination is looking at other options, expanding trade schools. We're always going to need plumbers. We're always going to need electricians, gardeners, people that repair the streets. They are vital parts of our economy, our social life, and our structure of a society. And we need to place an importance on that. Because yes, the world needs doctors, the world needs lawyers, the world needs philosophers, the world needs engineers. Yes. But there are also so many more things that we need that do not require higher education. That you can graduate from high school, go to a trade school for a year or two, open up your own business, and make 6 figures a year. It's possible. Not everybody is. Look, I'm a lover of knowledge. I am a true philosopher. I love knowledge. I can sit here and admit everyone doesn't love knowledge. Some people just don't care. And that's okay. They don't have to care. We need to stop trying to force people to care about college when college is not for everybody. It's not. So what we also need to do, and this may seem far-fetched for people, is break up monopolies. Because one of the things that we could be doing is having artisans everywhere. Think about the cups you drink out of, the plates you eat on, the clothes you wear, the soap you use, the toothpaste you use. Think about all of these everyday supplies that you are constantly buying. Why aren't you buying them from your neighbors? Why don't we live in a society where you can go to high school, get a nice basic education, become an artisan, and spend the rest of your life making beautiful plates because that's what you want to do, and you sell them? So what? It costs a little bit more money, but then that money is staying locally. It's staying in our local economies. It'll build our communities up because, and I'm going to get into this when we get into the Zebinar about wealth inequality, a void has been created where we're paying corporations all of this money to create basic things that can be created by communities around us. And think about the effect that would have on our carbon footprints, on making a greener society. If you're using clay that comes 50 miles away to create pots, to create cups, and you're selling them for a decent amount and you're earning a living, that's shipping that's not being shipped all across the world. We're not buying plates and cups that come out of China. And I'm just using plates and cups as just a nice, simple example. We're not buying clothes that come out of China, Thailand, Bangladesh, being shipped halfway across the world for what? When there are people in our communities, artisans, that could be doing this very stuff. And that was one of the things that made the Renaissance so great, that made that little period during the Enlightenment so great, is that people were able to build things, to be creative, to have outlets in society. But we have forced people to believe that they need to go to college and get an office job, that we're destroying so many of the things that make us human. And so I'm so sorry. I meant to change this for a question about student loan crisis. But I've pretty much gone into it for a final note. This applies for higher education too, and the student loan crisis too. What is it meant to address? What is higher education meant to address? Is it solely meant to create more workers in society? Or is it actually meant to better society, to evolve people, to mold them to become better versions of themselves? Because when we tie education and when we tie student loans and say, oh, you went to professional school, you went to law school, you can afford to pay back your $200,000 in student loans. But what if I became a public defender and I made 40 grand a year? Then what? Because the Constitution mandates that each person has a right to counsel, and public defenders have a duty to defend indigent clients. So what about them? Then it's not feasible for people to pay to go to law school to become public defenders. So what happens to all of the poor people that need representation? What about the people who are poor and need medical care? What if you want to go to med school and become a doctor that cares for the poor? But you can't do that. You cannot afford your life because you have so much student loans. And this is a part of the corporatization of our world, where we are so straddled with debt that we can't even do things for the public good anymore because we're so bogged down for no reason, when all it would take is raising taxes on the top 1%, the top 10%, and using it for public goods like higher education. So there is a way out of the student loan crisis, and it takes an honest assessment of where we are and how we got in this situation. And if you don't want to, fine. We can sit back and wait for economic collapse to meet us all because it's coming, baby. It's coming. It's a reality. Or we can do something about it. Take your pick.